A 15-year-old girl's voice was silenced, her freedom stolen, all for daring to speak the truth. The mountain man, a figure shrouded in mystery and strength, became her unlikely savior, breaking the chains that bound her to darkness. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The weight of Cedar Hollow's secrets pressed down on Mary Johnson's shoulders like an invisible burden. She felt it every morning when she walked through the town square, watching as neighbors exchanged tight smiles that never reached their eyes. At 15, Mary understood more about the unspoken rules of her community than most adults cared to admit. Her father, Robert Johnson, commanded respect wherever he went. As head of the town council, his word wasn't just suggestion, it was law. The wooden gavel he wielded during meetings might as well have been carved from the same unyielding oak as his personality. What made Robert truly dangerous, though, wasn't his authority but his silence. The things he refused to discuss cast longer shadows than any proclamation. "We don't speak of such matters," he would say whenever Mary broached uncomfortable topics at the dinner table. His eyes would harden, warning her without words that some questions were better left unasked. Unlike the other children of Cedar Hollow, Mary never learned to lower her gaze or seal her lips. While her peers mastered the art of selective blindness, walking past the abandoned house where screams had once echoed, or ignoring how certain families disappeared overnight, she refused to participate in the collective amnesia. "What happened to the Miller family?" she once asked during a community gathering, her voice cutting through polite conversation like a knife. The room had fallen silent, elderly Mrs. Patterson nearly dropping her teacup. "They were here last month, and now their house stands empty." The council chamber became Mary's battleground. She attended meetings, sitting quietly at first, absorbing every evasion and half-truth. Then she began taking notes, connecting dots that others pretended not to see. Some townspeople would catch her eye across the room, a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, crossing their faces before they looked away. "That Johnson girl asks too many questions," they whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Her father saw only defiance in her action. Each question was a challenge to his authority, each observation an act of rebellion. During council meetings, his jaw would tighten whenever she raised her hand, knowing whatever came next would disturb the carefully maintained peace. "You're making trouble where there is none," Robert told her one evening, his voice low and controlled as they walked home from the council chamber. "This town has prospered under careful guidance. Some matters are handled quietly for everyone's benefit." But Mary knew better. The town listened when she spoke. She could feel it in the held breaths and averted gazes. Her words found purchase in their minds, even as they pretended indifference. Her father, however, saw only a daughter who refused to know her place in Cedar Hollow's carefully ordered world. The council chamber's oak-paneled walls seemed to close in as Mary Johnson rose from her seat. The room was packed with Cedar Hollow's most influential residents, all gathered for the monthly town meeting. Overhead lights cast harsh shadows across faces that had grown comfortable with silence. "I want to know about the Anderson family," Mary said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "and the Wilsons, and everyone else who's disappeared when they asked too many questions." 15 pairs of eyes locked onto the teenager. No one had spoken these names aloud in years. "What happened to them?" she continued, gripping the edge of her chair. "Why does everyone pretend they never existed?" Robert Johnson's knuckles whitened around his gavel. The head of the town council, her father, stared at his daughter with cold fury building behind his eye. "This meeting concerns road maintenance and festival planning," he said, each word precise and measured. "Not wild accusations." Mary stood taller. "They aren't wild. I found newspaper clippings in the library archives. People who spoke against the council vanished. Their homes were sold. Their children transferred to schools in different states." The chamber fell completely silent. Mary could hear the ancient wall clock ticking, marking seconds that stretched like hours. "You've been digging through restricted records," an elderly councilman muttered. "Restricted because they're true." Mary counted. "Cedar Hollow has secrets, and everyone in this room knows it." Her father's face transformed, hardening into something unrecognizable. The last traces of paternal warmth vanished as he slammed the gavel down. "You're a child," he spat, his voice cold and final. A foolish child who understands nothing about protecting a community. With a subtle nod from Robert, two men, council enforcers who usually stood silently at the chamber doors, moved toward Mary. Their hands were gentle but firm as they gripped her arms. "What are you doing?" she demanded, struggling against their hold. "Let go of me." Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. "The Johnson family has served this town for 4 generations. I won't let you destroy everything we've built." Within hours, Mary found herself in the town square, a place normally reserved for festivals and celebrations. Now it held only her and a rusted iron cage, an artifact from another century, dragged from the town museum's basement. The metal bars bit into her skin as the lock clicked shut. Townsfolk gathered at a distance, their expressions a mixture of horror and resignation. Some turned away, hurrying past with downcast eyes. Others stared openly, a warning to their own children about the price of speaking out. As darkness fell, Mary wrapped her arms around herself against the growing chill. She was a spectacle now, Cedar Hollow's lesson in obedience and punishment for everyone to witness. The townsfolk of Cedar Hollow gathered in hushed clusters around the square. Their whispers carried on the evening breeze like autumn leaves. Mary Johnson sat upright in the rusted cage, her thin shoulders squared despite the cold that had begun to seep through her clothes. The iron bars cast long shadows across her face, but her eyes remained clear and defiant, watching each person who dared to look her way. "Robert's gone too far this time," muttered an elderly woman, quickly silenced by her husband's warning grip on her arm. The teenager's fingers curled around the metal bars, knuckles white with tension. She could hear them, all of them, their half-formed concerns evaporating into nothing as soon as anyone mentioned her father's name. The head of the town council had made his point clear: question authority, and this would be your fate. As twilight deepened into night, the temperature dropped sharply. Mary's body betrayed her with involuntary shivers, but she refused to curl into herself for warmth that would look like surrender. Instead, she memorized faces: Mrs. Peterson averting her eyes while clutching her groceries, Mr. Winters shaking his head before hurrying his children away, her own classmates stealing glances before their parents ushered them home. "Someone should do something," a voice said from somewhere in the darkness. "And end up in there too," came the swift reply. Mary pressed her palms against the cold iron, feeling the rough metal bite into her skin. The pain was clarifying, a reminder that she was still here, still herself. The cage might contain her body, but her mind remained free. She made a silent vow to remember every person who turned away, every coward who chose safety over what was right. Hours passed. The square emptied as Cedar Hollow's residents retreated to their warm homes and comfortable beds. Only the occasional patrol sent by Robert Johnson circled the cage, ensuring his daughter remained an example to anyone harboring rebellious thoughts. Alone in the darkness, Mary tilted her head back to look at the stars. They seemed impossibly bright tonight, pinpricks of light in the vast emptiness. Something stirred within her, not despair but its opposite. A tiny, stubborn flame of hope flickered in her chest. This couldn't be the end of her story. Someone, somewhere, would hear her. Someone would understand. In the shadows beyond the square's edge, something moved, just a whisper of motion, there and gone. Mary straightened, suddenly alert. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. She kept her eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting as a night grew colder around her iron prison. The moonlight cast long shadows across Cedar Hollow as the town settled into uneasy slumber. Only the occasional dog bark disturbed the silence that had fallen over the square where Mary Johnson remained imprisoned. The metal cage gleamed dully in the pale light, its occupant huddled against the night's growing chill. From the edge of the forest, a figure materialized like a shadow given form. John Smith moved with the deliberate grace of someone accustomed to moving unseen. His weathered face, framed by an unkempt beard, betrayed little emotion, but his eyes, sharp and alert, missed nothing as they scanned the deserted square. The mountain man was more legend than person to most in Cedar Hollow. Children whispered stories about him around campfires, and adults spoke his name with equal parts fear and reverence. Some townsfolk claimed he had perished during the harsh winter 3 years prior. Others insisted he had become one with the wilderness, a spirit of the mountains rather than a man of flesh and blood. John paused at the tree line, his calloused hand resting on the rough bark of an ancient oak. He wore clothes that had seen better days, faded flannel beneath a leather coat patched in multiple places, pants worn thin at the knees. Nothing about him suggested wealth or power, yet he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who answered to no one. The survivalist had not ventured this close to town in years, preferring the solitude of his cabin and the honest company of the wilderness. But tonight, something had drawn him down from his mountain refuge, perhaps the same instinct that warned him of approaching storms or guided him to fresh game trails. When his gaze fell upon the iron cage in the center of the square, John's body tensed. He recognized Robert Johnson's handiwork immediately, the council head's particular brand of cruelty disguised as justice. But it was the cage's occupant that caused the recluse's jaw to clench with barely contained fury. A child. They had imprisoned a child. Even from this distance, he could see it was Mary, Robert's daughter. The teenager whose questions had always been too pointed, whose curiosity had clearly become too dangerous for her father's comfort. John had occasionally glimpsed her exploring the foothills, her spirit as untamed as the wilderness he called home. Something primal stirred within the mountain man as he watched her shiver against the bars. His weathered face hardened into a mask of determination. Cedar Hollow had gone too far this time. The town's secrets had claimed too many victims already. John Smith stepped from the shadows, his decision made. Tonight, those chains would break. Without a word, John Smith approached the cage, every step deliberate and heavy. His weathered boots barely made a sound against the dirt of Cedar Hollow's town square. The mountain man moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew the wilderness better than civilization, his eyes fixed on the iron prison that held Mary Johnson. The townspeople who might have stopped him were fast asleep in their beds, oblivious to the rebellion brewing in the shadows beneath the pale moonlight. The cage stood as a stark symbol of Cedar Hollow's justice, rusted iron bars forming a cruel enclosure barely large enough for the 15-year-old to sit upright. Mary's eyes widened as she recognized the recluse from local legends. She had heard whispers about the mountain man, but had never seen him in person until this moment. His presence seemed to make the very air around them still. John circled the cage once, assessing its weaknesses with practiced eye. The chains securing the door were thick, but worn by years of exposure to the elements. Without hesitation, he reached for the heavy padlock, his calloused hands wrapping around cold metal. Mary watched, barely breathing, as the survivalist positioned himself for maximum leverage. With a single powerful motion, John gripped the chains and pulled. His muscles strained beneath his worn coat as decades of mountain living lent him unnatural strength. Metal shrieked and snapped, falling away like dead vines, the sound echoing through the empty square. The door swung open with a haunting creak that seemed to announce freedom itself. "They'll hear," Mary whispered, her voice hoarse from hours of exposure. The recluse merely shook his head, unconcerned with consequences. He reached into the cage and lifted Mary from her prison as if she weighed nothing at all, her thin frame shivering against the night air. Her legs, cramped from confinement, struggled to support her weight as he set her down gently. John's face remained impassive, but his eyes burned with quiet fury at what Robert Johnson had done to his own daughter. He nodded toward a dark shape waiting at the edge of the square, his horse tethered to a post and standing patient and ready. "Get on," he said, his voice low and gravelly from disuse. The words weren't a request but a lifeline thrown to someone drowned. Mary glanced back at the town that had watched her punishment without protest, at the council chamber where her father had ordered her imprisonment, and at the broken cage that had failed to contain her spirit. In that moment, she made her choice. Mary Johnson didn't hesitate for a second. She scrambled onto the horse behind John Smith, her trembling fingers clutching his worn leather coat as they galloped away from Cedar Hollow. The wind whipped through her hair and stung her cheeks, carrying the dual bite of freedom and fear. Each thundering hoofbeat put distance between her and the iron cage that had been her prison just moments before. "Hold tight," the mountain man called over his shoulder, his voice barely audible above the rush of their escape. Mary pressed herself against his back, feeling the solid strength of someone who knew these woods like they were extensions of his own body. They rode through the darkness, the horse navigating treacherous terrain with surprising confidence. John guided the animal with subtle movements, following winding trails that seemed invisible to Mary's untrained eyes. Moonlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, casting ghostly patterns across the forest floor. The teenager glanced back once, half expecting to see torches and angry townspeople in pursuit, but there was only darkness behind them. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and cold. Mary's hands began to ache from gripping John's coat so tightly, but she dared not loosen her hold. Her father, Robert Johnson, would be furious when he discovered her gone. The head of the town council wasn't a man who tolerated defiance, especially from his own daughter. Hours passed in a blur of shadows and silence. The mountain man rarely spoke, only occasionally pointing out a landmark or warning of a low-hanging branch. Mary's exhaustion battled with her adrenaline as they continued their ascent, following paths that seemed to exist only in John's memory. When dawn finally broke, painting the eastern sky with streaks of pink and gold, they emerged into a hidden clearing. Ancient trees stood like sentinels around the perimeter, their massive trunks and sprawling canopies creating a natural fortress. A small stream trickled nearby, its gentle burbling the only sound breaking the quiet hush of their sanctuary. John Smith dismounted first, then helped Mary down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, stiff from the long ride and weak from her ordeal in the cage. "No one knows about this place," he said, his weathered face softening slightly as he surveyed their surroundings. "We'll be safe here for now." Mary nodded, taking in deep breaths of the mountain air. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel the weight of Cedar Hollow's secrets pressing down on her. In this clearing, surrounded by wilderness and watched over by a man who'd risked everything to free her, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. The mountain air filled Mary Johnson's lungs with a clarity she had never experienced in Cedar Hollow. Each morning she woke in John Smith's simple cabin to the sound of birds rather than whispers and judgment. The wooden walls, worn smooth by years of mountain winters, felt more like home than her father's house ever had. "Listen," John would say, his weathered hand pointing to the forest. "The mountain speaks if you're patient enough to hear it." At first, Mary thought the mountain man was being poetic, but soon she understood. He taught her to recognize the warning call of jays when predators approached, to feel the shift in wind that signaled storms, to read the subtle movements of deer through underbrush. John showed her how to move silently through the forest, her footsteps becoming as gentle as his. "This track is fresh," he explained one morning, kneeling beside a print in soft earth. "See how the edges are still sharp. The deer passed through less than an hour ago." Mary learned to gather wild blackberries without pricking her fingers, to identify which mushrooms were safe and which would bring sickness. She discovered the sweetness of wild honey and the refreshing tang of creek water cupped in her palms. The forest, which had once seemed like a wall of green mystery, became a living pantry and classroom. During evenings by the fire, the recluse taught her to navigate by stars, tracing constellations with his finger against the night sky. "Even when clouds hide them," he said, "the stars are still there. Remember that." What surprised Mary most wasn't what John taught, but what he didn't. He never questioned her about returning to town. He didn't press her about confronting Robert or the council. There were no lectures about responsibility or duty concepts her father had wielded like weapons. Instead, the survivalist gave her something she'd never had in Cedar Hollow: space. Space to breathe. Space to remember who she was beneath the layers of fear and defiance that had become her armor. Sometimes, Mary would find herself sitting on a sun-warmed rock, listening to nothing but the rustle of leaves and her own heartbeat. In those moments, the iron cage seemed to belong to another lifetime, though the memory of cold metal against her skin remained. John would watch her from a distance, his eyes carrying a knowing sadness. He recognized healing when he saw it, had witnessed it before in others he'd brought to these mountains. The girl was finding herself again, shedding the cage that had contained her even before the physical one appeared. And that, John knew, was more important than any survival skill he could teach. As the days melted into weeks, Mary Johnson began to notice the peculiar rhythms of her rescuer's life. John Smith was unlike anyone she had ever known in Cedar Hollow. While he moved through the daylight hours with purpose and strength, teaching her the ways of the mountain, nighttime revealed a different man entirely. Mary often woke to find his bed empty, the cabin door slightly ajar. The first few times she had pulled the blanket tight around herself, afraid to follow. But curiosity eventually overcame fear. One particularly clear night, she noticed him slip out just after midnight. The mountain man moved with surprising grace for someone of his size, barely disturbing the undergrowth as he navigated the forest path. Mary followed at a distance, her footsteps carefully placed as he had taught her. The moonlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor. John's broad shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight as he walked, his usual confident stride replaced by something more deliberate, almost ceremonial. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, they reached a clearing Mary had never seen before. A perfect circle of ancient stones rose from the earth, each one taller than she was. They looked impossibly old, worn smooth in places by centuries of wind and rain. John entered the circle and knelt at its center. The haunted expression she had glimpsed on previous nights now fully claimed his features. He pressed his weathered hands against the earth, fingers splayed wide as if trying to touch something beneath the surface. Words flowed from his lips in a whispered stream, too faint for Mary to catch more than fragments. The language sounded strange, older than English, with rhythms that seemed to match the rustling leaves and distant owl calls. A twig snapped beneath Mary's foot, and John's head turned sharply. His eyes found her immediately in the darkness. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping into the moonlight. "I was worried about you." The mountain man didn't seem angry. Instead, a flicker of understanding crossed his face. He gestured for her to approach, and Mary cautiously entered the stone circle, feeling a strange vibration beneath her feet. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice hushed with reverence. John was quiet for a long moment, his gaze traveling around the circle before returning to her face. "These mountains call back those who are lost," he finally said, his gravelly voice softer than usual. Mary waited for more, but John simply rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his knees. The haunted look remained in his eyes, but something else had joined it. A quiet resolve, as if some decision had been made. As they walked back to the cabin together, Mary sensed that John Smith carried secrets as deep and ancient as the mountains themselves, secrets that might one day become hers to bear. Mary's curiosity grew with each passing day in the mountain. The freedom John Smith had given her only fueled her desire to understand more about him, about Cedar Hollow, and about the secrets that had led to her imprisonment. One crisp afternoon, while John was tracking deer in the lower valley, Mary decided to explore the hills above his cabin. The autumn air filled her lungs as she climbed, feeling stronger than she had in weeks. Her hands, once soft from town life, had grown calloused and capable from her time in the wilderness. The rocky outcrop above the cabin offered a view that stretched for miles, forests, valleys, and far in the distance, the faint outline of Cedar Hollow. Mary shuddered at the sight of her former home, then turned back toward the small wooden structure that had become her sanctuary. Inside, she noticed something she hadn't before, a floorboard near the hearth that didn't quite sit flush with the others. Kneeling down, Mary worked her fingers around the edge until it lifted, revealing a hollow space beneath. Her heart quickened as she pulled out an old leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth from years of handling. "I shouldn't," she whispered to herself, but her fingers were already opening to the first page. The journal was filled with meticulous handwriting, names, dates, and detailed accounts spanning over 15 years. Each entry described someone John had helped escape from Cedar Hollow. There were dozens of stories, each following a similar pattern. Someone spoke out, faced punishment, and John intervened. Sarah Winters, 32, schoolteacher, Mary read. Questioned counsel about missing library funds, found locked in town hall basement, relocated to Pinecrest. Page after page revealed a hidden history of her town, a pattern of silencing and punishment that had been happening long before she was even born. The mountain man hadn't just saved her on impulse, he had been waging a quiet war against Cedar Hollow's injustices for years. As she reached the later entries, the tone darkened. John wrote of threats, of men sent to hunt him, of people who had tried to expose the truth and disappeared. The final pages contained warnings, sketched maps of safe routes, and lists of allies in neighboring towns. Mary closed the journal, her hands trembling. The realization washed over her like cold mounting water. John Smith had been fighting her father and the council long before she ever spoke out. Her cage wasn't the first, and unless something changed, it wouldn't be the last. She carefully returned the journal to its hiding place, but not before committing several names to memory. When John returned that evening, Mary watched him with new eyes, understanding at last the weight he carried on his weathered shoulders. Cedar Hollow simmered with unease in Mary Johnson's absence. The town square, once the site of her public humiliation, now stood as a reminder of their collective shame and Robert Johnson's fury. The head of the town council paced the chamber floors each night, his face a mask of cold determination as he dispatched yet another search party into the surrounding wilderness. "Find her," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for failure. Whatever it took. Every few weeks, men trudged through the dense forest carrying lanterns and tracking dogs. They returned with mud-caked boots and empty hands, unable to locate any trace of the 15-year-old girl or the mountain recluse who had spirited her away. The forest seemed to swallow their shouts, the mountains conspiring to keep Mary hidden from those who sought to cage her again. John Smith watched them from hidden vantage points, teaching Mary to recognize the signs of approaching danger: broken twigs, disturbed undergrowth, the unnatural silence when strangers entered the woods. These lessons became part of their daily routine, as essential as gathering food or tending the fire. One evening, as shadows lengthened across the clearing, a knock echoed through the cabin. John motioned for Mary to hide in the back room before opening the door to find a stranger standing on his threshold. The man wore a black coat that seemed to absorb what little light remained in the day. His posture suggested city breeding, his eyes calculating as they swept the cabin's interior. "I represent interested parties in Cedar Hollow," the stranger said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He reached inside his coat and produced a heavy pouch that clinked with unmistakable weight. Gold. Quite a substantial amount for the return of Robert Johnson's daughter. John's expression remained impassive, though his shoulders tensed slightly. "There's no girl here." The stranger's smile never reached his eyes. "We both know that's not true." He placed the pouch on the rough-hewn table. "Consider this a generous offer. The alternative would be unfortunate." The mountain man didn't touch the gold. He stood like an ancient tree, rooted and unmovable. "Leave." The stranger retrieved the pouch with a sigh that suggested disappointment rather than surprise. At the doorway, he turned back, his face half hidden in shadow. "If she's not returned, everything you've built will burn. The council doesn't tolerate defiance, not even from ghosts like you." After the man departed, Mary emerged from hiding, her face pale but resolute. The threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the wood smoke from their fire. John didn't speak about the threat for 3 days. The cabin felt heavier with his silence, as if the mountain man carried the weight of unseen dangers on his shoulders. Mary noticed how he checked the perimeter more frequently, his weathered face scanning the tree line with newfound vigilance. On the 4th night, Mary Johnson woke to the sound of scraping. She found John Smith kneeling by the eastern wall of the cabin, his large hands meticulously carving strange symbols into the wooden beams. The knife in his grip moved with practiced precision, etching marks that resembled no language she recognized. "What are you doing?" Mary asked, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill. John didn't look up, his focus unwavering as the blade continued its work. "Protection," he muttered, the word barely audible. "The old ways remember what people forget." Mary watched as he finished one symbol, a spiral with 3 lines cutting through it, before moving to the next beam. His movements were rhythmic, almost like a prayer translated into motion. The 15-year-old girl sat cross-legged on the floor beside him, mesmerized by the quiet intensity of his work. "My grandmother taught me these," John finally said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "She said they keep evil intentions from crossing your threshold." "Do you believe that?" Mary asked. The mountain man paused, his knife hovering over the wood. "I believe in being prepared." His eyes, usually so guarded, met hers with unexpected openness. "That man who came here, he won't be the last. Your father and the council won't stop until they silence what you know." Mary felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Robert Johnson had always valued order above all else, even above his own daughter. The thought of her father sending men to drag her back to Cedar Hollow made her stomach tighten. John suddenly stopped carving. He studied the knife in his hand, turning it so the blade caught the dim light from the fireplace. Then, with a decisive movement, he extended the handle toward Mary. "It's time," he said, his gravelly voice softening. "You're not meant to hide. You must carve your own path now." Mary hesitated before taking the knife. It was heavier than she expected, the wooden handle smooth from years of use. "But I don't know how to make these symbols," she protested. John shook his head. "Not symbols. Your story, your truth." He placed his calloused hand over hers. "Cedar Hollow tried to cage you for speaking out. Now you need to decide what you're going to do with your voice." Mary's fingers tightened around the knife, feeling its weight. Not just as a tool, but as a choice. Mary Johnson felt something shifting inside her, like a seed breaking through soil after a long winter. The lessons John Smith had taught her weren't just about survival anymore. They were becoming part of who she was. Each morning she ventured farther from the cabin, following deer trails that wound through thickets and across rocky streams. The mountain man watched her progress with quiet approval. He never praised her directly, but she noticed how he'd nod when she returned with a handful of wild herbs or successfully built a fire in the rain. His silent acknowledgement meant more than any words could express. "The forest speaks if you know how to listen," John told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "It's not about conquering the wilderness, it's about becoming part of it." Mary took these words to heart. She learned to move silently through underbrush, to read the sky for coming weather, and to find her way back to the cabin using only the stars and the shape of the land. Each small victory built her confidence, washing away the helplessness she'd felt inside that iron cage. But even as Mary grew stronger, shadows from Cedar Hollow stretched toward their mountain sanctuary. Twice now she'd spotted search parties in the valley below, men with rifles slung across their backs. Though they never ventured high enough to discover John's cabin, their presence was a constant reminder that her father, Robert Johnson, had not forgotten his wayward daughter. One night, unable to sleep, Mary slipped outside and climbed to a ridge, overlooking the distant lights of Cedar Hollow. The town looked so small from here, yet its power to harm still loomed large in her mind. "You can't hide forever," John said, appearing beside her so quietly she hadn't heard his approach. "I know," she whispered, hugging her knees to her chest. The mountain man settled beside her, his weathered face illuminated by moonlight. "Freedom isn't just about escaping your cage, Mary. Sometimes it means facing those who built it." She turned to study his profile, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You've been preparing me all along, haven't you?" He nodded once. "The town has secrets that need telling, people who need justice." Mary looked back toward Cedar Hollow, feeling resolve crystallize within her. Running had given her strength, but it wouldn't bring change. If she truly wanted freedom, not just for herself, but for everyone, her father and the council had silenced, she would need to return and confront the darkness at its source. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. For days, Mary pored over John's weathered journals, her fingers tracing the faded ink of names long forgotten by Cedar Hollow. Each page revealed another layer of the town's dark history: families silenced, dissenters who mysteriously disappeared, and council meetings where her father, Robert Johnson, had orchestrated it all. "These are real people," she whispered to herself, carefully copying names and dates onto scraps of paper. The cabin walls seemed to close in around her as the magnitude of Cedar Hollow's secrets became clear. Some entries dated back 20 years, long before she was born, showing how deeply rooted the corruption had become. One journal contained detailed accounts of 3 teenagers who had questioned the council's land dealings, only to be sent away to boarding schools that didn't exist. Another documented how the town's previous doctor was forced to leave after threatening to report suspicious injuries among those who spoke against the council. The mountain man had been meticulous in his record-keeping. John had collected statements, letters, even council minutes that someone had smuggled to him over the years. Mary realized he hadn't just been hiding in these mountains, he'd been building a case, waiting for the right moment. "This is what you were preparing me for," she said to the empty cabin. Understanding now why he'd rescued her. She wasn't just another victim. She was Robert Johnson's daughter, the perfect witness. When thunder rolled across the mountains that evening, Mary took it as a sign. She gathered the evidence into a leather satchel, pulled on John's old raincoat, and began the treacherous descent down muddy trails toward Cedar Hollow. The journey took hours, rain soaking through to her skin, despite the protection. By the time the town's lights appeared through the trees, Mary was drenched but resolute. She knew the council would be meeting. They always did on the last Thursday of the month. Without hesitation, she pushed open the heavy doors of the council chamber. Gasps echoed through the room as heads turned to see the girl everyone believed had run away or died in the wilderness. Mary, her father stammered, rising from his chair at the head of the long table. The color drained from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. The teenager didn't flinch. She walked forward, her muddy boots leaving tracks on the polished floor, and began laying out papers one by one. "I know what you did," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know about the Miller family, about Dr. Thompson, about the Wilkins children." She looked directly at Robert, whose authoritative demeanor had crumbled. "And I have proof of every single person this town has silenced." The council members exchanged nervous glances as Mary continued spreading the evidence before them, truth spilling across their pristine table like the unstoppable rain outside. Robert Johnson's face drained of color as his daughter stood before the council, her hands steady despite the weight of the documents she carried. The council chamber, once a fortress of secrecy, now felt exposed under the harsh light of truth. "The cage wasn't just for me," Mary declared, her voice echoing against the wooden walls. "It was for anyone who dared to speak." Her eyes, unflinching and clear, swept across the faces of those who had once condemned her. "Every person who questioned you ended up silenced one way or another." The townspeople had gathered outside, drawn by whispers of Mary's return. They pressed against windows and doorways, straining to hear as she methodically laid out her evidence. Names of those who had disappeared over the years, dates of mysterious accidents, records of land seized and lives destroyed, all tied to those who had challenged the council's authority. "My daughter is clearly disturbed by her time in the wilderness," Robert attempted, his authoritative voice now brittle with desperation. "These are fabrications, the ramblings of—" "These are your own records," Mary interrupted, holding up a leather-bound journal with her father's handwriting. "John Smith wasn't just saving people from you, he was documenting everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd. An elderly woman pushed forward, her hands trembling. "That's my son's name," she said, pointing to the list. "You told us he left town for work." The council members exchanged glances, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. Thomas Fletcher, the town treasurer, rose to his feet. "We've always done what was necessary to protect Cedar Hollow," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "Protect it from what?" Mary challenged. "From the truth? From change? From its own people?" Outside, the crowd had grown. Neighbors who had watched in silence as Mary was caged now pressed closer, their faces a mixture of shock, shame, and dawning anger. Parents clutched children tighter, recognizing for the first time the invisible chains that had bound them all. Robert made one final attempt to regain control. "You have no proof these documents are authentic," he said, but his words fell flat as Mary produced letters, photographs, and testimonies, each piece more damning than the last. "I have everything," she said quietly. "And now, so does everyone else." The people of Cedar Hollow, once so certain of their place in the hierarchy, now looked at each other with new eyes. The council's power had always rested on collective silence, a silence that, with each revelation from Mary's lips, shattered like glass against stone. For 3 days, John Smith vanished without a trace. Mary searched frantically through every hollow and ridge of the mountain terrain that had become her sanctuary. She called his name until her throat burned raw, her voice echoing through the silent forest that suddenly felt vast and unwelcoming. "John!" Her cries scattered birds from treetops, but no answering call came back. The cabin felt hollow without his presence. Mary paced the wooden floors where his heavy footsteps should have been. running her fingers along the strange protective symbols he had carved into the beams. The mountain man had taught her to track, to listen, to survive, but finding someone who didn't want to be found was another matter entirely. On the fourth morning, dark clouds gathered over the peaks. Mary stood at the cabin door, watching the sky turn an ominous slate gray. The forest animals had gone quiet, sensing the approaching storm. Something pulled at her instincts, a feeling John had taught her to trust. "He's out there," she whispered to herself, grabbing a worn leather pack and filling it with supply. The rain began as a gentle patter, but quickly transformed into sheets of water that drenched the forest floor. Mary pressed forward, her boots sinking into mud as lightning cracked overhead. The storm's fury matched her determination as she ventured deeper into parts of the forest she'd never explored. Near a ravine where three mountains met, a massive oak had stood for centuries. Mary had passed it many times during her lessons with John. Now, as she approached through the downpour, she saw it had finally surrendered to time and storm, its enormous trunk splintered and fallen. That's when she spotted him. John Smith lay partially beneath the massive tree, rainwater pooling around his still form. His weathered face was peaceful, despite the circumstances, as if he'd known this moment was coming. Mary dropped to her knees beside him, mud soaking through her clothes as she reached for his hand. His palms bore fresh carvings, the same mysterious symbols that protected the cabin. They formed intricate patterns across his skin, still visible despite the rain washing over them. Blood had dried in the lines, telling Mary he had done this to himself, deliberately. "Why?" she whispered, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheek. The mountain man had made his final sacrifice, completing whatever ritual he'd begun at the cabin. Mary understood then that John had known the danger coming from Cedar Hollow would require more than physical protection. He had given everything to ensure she would be safe. Kneeling in the storm, Mary finally grasped his ultimate lesson. Some truths demand the highest price, and true freedom requires sacrifice. With trembling fingers, she closed his eyes, the rain continuing to fall around them like a veil between worlds. Mary Johnson knelt in the mud, rain still dripping from her hair, as she tried to process her grief. John's body had been taken to a small clearing where she'd covered him with stones in the mountain tradition he'd taught her. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a silence that felt unbearably empty. Returning to the cabin, Mary noticed something strange. A corner of the wooden floor had been lifted by the floodwaters. Beneath the loose plank gleamed a metal box she'd never seen before. Her hands trembled as she pulled it free from its hiding place. Inside lay a leather pouch containing a folded letter in John Smith's rough handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm gone," it began, "but my work isn't finished, and neither is yours." The box contained detailed records, names of every person who had been silenced by Cedar Hollow's council over the past 20 years. There were maps marking hidden graves, transcripts of secret meetings, and damning evidence against her father, Robert Johnson, and his fellow council members. "These people deserve justice," John had written, "and you're the only one strong enough to deliver it." Mary spread the documents across the cabin floor, piecing together the full extent of the town's corruption. She recognized some names, people who had disappeared, supposedly moving away for better opportunities. The truth was far darker. She found a small wooden carving at the bottom of the box. A bird breaking free from a cage. John had been teaching her to carve, but his hands had created this final message for her. Mary clutched it tightly, feeling her grief transform into something harder, more purposeful. "I'll finish what you started," she whispered to the empty cabin. That night she packed only what she needed: the documents, some food, and the knife John had given her. The 15-year-old studied her reflection in the cabin's cracked mirror. Her eyes looked older now, hardened by loss, but burning with determination. At dawn, Mary mounted the horse that had carried them both to freedom and began the journey back to Cedar Hollow. The mountain paths seemed to guide her, as if John's spirit walked beside her. She rehearsed what she would say, how she would face her father and the council who had caused so much pain. The town appeared on the horizon just as the sun reached its peak. Mary straightened her back, John's evidence secure in her saddlebag. She couldn't bring her mentor back, but she could ensure his sacrifice meant something. For John, she whispered, urging the horse forward. For everyone they tried to silence. Mary Johnson stood on the weathered steps of the council chamber, clutching John's documents with white knuckles. The entire town of Cedar Hollow had gathered, drawn by whispers of the girl who had escaped the cage and returned with fire in her eyes. Robert Johnson sat rigid among the council members, his face a mask of stone as his daughter faced the crowd. "You cannot erase the truth," Mary declared, her voice carrying across the square with unexpected strength. "You cannot break what you cannot control." The townspeople shifted uncomfortably, exchanging nervous glances. Some had witnessed her imprisonment weeks earlier, had watched as the iron cage was locked around her thin frame. Others had turned away, pretending not to see. Now, they had nowhere to hide. Mary opened the leather-bound journal, her fingers tracing the names written in John's careful hand. "Sarah Williams," she began, locked away for 3 months in 1987 for questioning the council's land seizures. She looked up, finding an elderly woman in the crowd who nodded, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Thomas Green disappeared after speaking about the polluted well that made children sick." A man in the back removed his hat, head bowed in remembrance. Name after name echoed through the square. With each one, Mary watched recognition dawn on the faces before her. These weren't just stories, they were neighbors, relatives, friends who had been silenced. Robert Johnson's composure finally cracked. "That's enough," he shouted, rising to his feet. "No, Father," Mary replied, her voice steady. "For once, it isn't enough to silence me." She continued reading, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. The council members shifted in their seats, unable to meet the accusing stares of their neighbors. The mayor, a man who had served alongside her father for 15 years, hung his head in shame as Mary revealed how he had falsified water quality reports. "John Smith knew," Mary said, her voice softening at his name. "The mountain man kept records of everything. He saved me, but he couldn't save everyone." The evidence was undeniable. Documents bearing official seals, signed confessions from former council members, photographs of environmental destruction carefully hidden from public view. The town's foundation of secrets was crumbling beneath the weight of truth. As Mary finished reading the final name, a profound silence fell over Cedar Hollow. The chains of fear that had bound the community for generations seemed to loosen, link by link, as the 15-year-old girl stood unwavering before those who had once imprisoned her. In that moment, Mary wasn't just speaking for herself. She was giving voice to everyone who had ever been silenced by power and fear. Tears streamed down weathered faces as Mary Johnson stood before them, her voice unwavering. Some townspeople openly wept, decades of buried guilt finally surfacing in the town square where she had once been caged. Others turned away, shoulders hunched, unable to bear the weight of their complicity. The evidence she presented was irrefutable. Names, dates, testimonies, all meticulously documented in John's leather-bound journal. "My father taught me that silence keeps order," Mary said, her gaze finding Robert among the crowd. The head of the town council could not meet his daughter's eyes, but silence only protects those who abuse power. An elderly woman stepped forward, trembling. "They took my son 30 years ago," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I never spoke of it. I was too afraid." Others followed hesitantly at first, then with growing conviction stories of intimidation, of disappearances, of punishments for those who questioned Cedar Hollow's leadership. Mary remained steady as the confessions poured forth. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, illuminating her face, no longer that of a frightened 15-year-old girl, but of someone who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. The mountain man's teachings were evident in her calm resilience, in how she stood with feet planted firmly on the ground, unshakable. Robert Johnson finally rose from his seat, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. "Mary," he began, his voice hollow, "I never meant—" "What you meant doesn't matter," she interrupted. "What you did does." The strange sensation washed over the gathering, as if invisible chains were breaking all around them. Mary could feel it in the air, in how people straightened their backs and found their voices. The council chamber would no longer be a place of whispered threats and secret judgments. "John Smith knew what this town was," Mary continued, He rescued those who were brave enough to speak, and now we honor him by continuing that work. The documents she had brought from the hidden box beneath John's cabin floor were passed through the crowd. People read them with wide eyes, recognizing names of neighbors, friends, family members who had vanished over the years. As the sun began to set over Cedar Hollow, something new took root in the soil that had been poisoned by fear for generations. It was fragile, a tender shoot of truth pushing through hard ground. But it was growing. Mary watched as townspeople spoke to one another openly, some embracing, others making plans. The cage that had once held her body could never contain her spirit. Now that spirit had spread through the entire town, breaking chains that had bound them all for far too long. Mary Johnson traced her fingers over the scars on her wrists, permanent reminders of the iron that had once bound her. The price of justice had been steep. John was gone, his body now resting beneath the ancient oaks he'd loved so dearly. She often found herself wandering to that spot, sitting in silence as leaves rustled overhead, carrying whispers she could almost understand. "You taught me everything except how to say goodbye," she murmured to the wind one evening, her voice catching on the words. The 15-year-old had grown older in ways that couldn't be measured by time. Her eyes held a depth that made even adults look away, uncomfortable with the wisdom they saw reflected there. The mountain paths had become her sanctuary, each step a meditation on what she had lost and what she had gained. Mary discovered that forgiveness wasn't what she had expected. It wasn't about absolving her father or the council members who had locked her away. The hardest person to forgive was herself, for the moments of doubt, for not finding John sooner, for the guilt that sometimes threatened to cage her again. "You can't carry everyone's pain," she remembered John saying once, his weathered hands steady as he showed her how to build a fire. "But you can carry your own without letting it break you." In the months that followed her confrontation with Cedar Hollow, Mary returned to the mountains regularly. She brought John's journal with her, adding her own observations beside his careful notes. The teenager documented the changing seasons, the wildlife patterns, and occasionally the names of others who sought refuge from their own cages. A young boy from the neighboring town found her one day, having heard whispers about the girl who broke free. Mary shared what food she had and listened to his story without judgment. When he finished speaking, she showed him how to find water by following certain birds, just as John had taught her. "The truth has weight," she told him, "but so does hope." As twilight settled over the mountains, Mary stood at the edge of the clearing where John had first brought her. The town lights twinkled low, no longer symbols of oppression but reminders of unfinished work. She wasn't the girl in the cage anymore. She was something else entirely, something forged in both pain and possibility. Mary took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air and turned toward home, her steps sure on the darkening path. The chains were broken, but their echoes remained, and in those echoes she had found her purpose. Cedar Hollow, transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The once silent streets now buzzed with conversation, as neighbors finally spoke truths long buried. Where fear had reigned, a cautious hope took root. Mary Johnson's courage had broken more than just her own chains. It had shattered the invisible bonds that had held an entire community captive for generations. In the town square where her cage once stood, the people of Cedar Hollow erected a simple wooden bench. No plaque, no grand monument, just a place to sit and speak freely. Children who once learned to stay quiet now asked questions that made their parents pause, then answer with newfound honesty. Robert Johnson resigned from the council, his authority crumbling under the weight of exposed secrets. The man who had once locked away his own daughter now lived alone in a house that felt more like a prison than any cage ever could. Some days Mary would see him watching her from his window, his eyes carrying a mixture of shame and something that might have been pride. The council chamber, once a fortress of whispers and threats, opened its doors to public meetings where every voice was heard. The town's history was rewritten, not erased but acknowledged in all its painful truth. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely, but at least they were no longer festering in darkness. Mary often climbed to the ridge overlooking Cedar Hollow, tracing the path she and John Smith had taken that moonlit night of her escape. Though the mountain man was gone, she felt his presence in every skill she now possessed. in her ability to track through forest, to read the weather in cloud patterns, to stand unmoved against those who would silence her. She began teaching others what John had taught, not just survival skills, but the courage to question, to seek truth, to carve their own paths. Young people especially sought her out, drawn to her story and strength. "The cage doesn't always look like iron bars," she would tell them, her voice steady and clear. "Sometimes it's just the fear of speaking up." As the seasons turned, Mary found herself returning to the ring of ancient stones where John had once knelt in quiet communion with the mountain. There she would press her hands to the earth and feel the steady heartbeat beneath, a reminder that some truths were as old and enduring as the land itself. When the morning sun broke over the eastern ridge, bathing Cedar Hollow in golden light, Mary stood tall on the mountainside. The wind caught her hair, wild and free. The chains were gone, the cage destroyed, and in their place, something far more powerful had grown, a voice that could never again be silenced.